folks, in this video we're going to be learning about the WatchKit interface slider, which is basically a visual control that we can use to select a floating point value, and we can associate those values with different things. So for example, if we have a label on screen, we can use a slider to kind of change the value of that label based on a number of predetermined values. So let's just jump right in here. We'll explore some of these attributes in our attributes inspector. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a slider here. Okay, and as we can see here, if I click on it and wait a second, it pops this out. Slider is a control for selecting a floating point value from a range of continuous or discrete values. Changes to the slider's value are reported to the specific action method of its parent interface or table row controller. So it sounds more complex than it actually is. Let's just kind of take a look at what attributes it has here. So first of all, these values in here, these represent the numerical value of the slider. So when these change, we can basically assign different values. So for example, if the slider is on value 1, we want a label to display certain text. Value 2 would be different. Value 3 would also be different, for example. So you might notice if you try to adjust these, the appearance might change or might not, depending on what you're doing. But really, in the end, these are basically numerical values that we're going to assign to do something or be something. For example, a string versus a different string. So let's kind of explore these though. So first of all, value. What this is the initial numerical value of the slider. So in our case, we're going to start it at 1. And it does kind of have a visual feedback portion of that as well. So if we started at value 0, we can see that it just kind of is blank. But if we start at value 1, this is going to be whatever we assign to be value 1 in our backend code, it's going to default to this as its initial value. So when it loads this interface. Next, we have minimum and maximum. And these are basically the lowest we will allow. So the lowest value we need and the highest number we need. So for example, if we're going to have 3 options, let's do that. So minimum will be 1. And we're going to default to that value using our value 1. Maximum it can go up to is 3. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. So minimum is the smallest numerical value allowed by the slider. Maximum is, of course, the biggest numerical value allowed by the slider. And you might notice in here, if I zoom in, it has kind of these notches to show where you are on the slider. You can increase those by using steps here. Right, so now I've increased it to 10, and if I zoom in a bit, we can see that there's now 10 slots. Doesn't really make sense though because we only have 3 values. So if I wanted to increase this to 10, right? So now we're going to have values 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to 10. In which case our display is reflecting that. But you know what? Let's put it back down to 3 and let's put our steps to 3 as well so that it's clear to the user that there are only 3 steps available. We also do have the option to display it as continuous. So instead of segmenting it, you can see here it's segmented into 3 steps. If we say continuous, well, now it's, instead of being steps, it's just going to kind of display in this manner. So one continuous way. And in my opinion, on WatchOS anyway, it's more advantageous to kind of show it as segmented. Because that way it's clear on such a tiny little screen, it's clearer to the user exactly what's going on. And also when it starts up, if we say value 1, it's going to kind of be only a little pip on the left. So this is how you can tell that, you know, basically nothing has been changed yet. So I prefer to kind of give some visual feedback to start off in value 1. Also, if you notice here, if I change value 1 to 0, the minimum value also goes to 0. So it kind of has that protection built in so that you don't have a value that's not associated with anything. But we'll come back to that. We'll explore that more in a little bit. The next thing to look at is kind of our usual stuff here. We've seen these before with various objects. The first of which is color. Right, so color you can choose from recently used. You can choose all kinds of different ways of selecting your color. For example, you can use a color wheel. You can use a slider. You can use these kind of presets or these color pencils, for example. But you know what? I'm going to leave it as the default green. That's kind of a nice color to kind of see the contrast. Next down here, min and max image. And all this does is allow you to set an image next to the minimum and another image next to the maximum in the slider. We're not going to be loading any images in this example though, so we're just going to leave it as is. And then also enabled So this will basically allow or disallow the user to use the slider. So if we say it's not enabled, so now it's going to be kind of grayed out and the user won't be able to affect the slider. But we're going to enable it because we're going to want to practice using it. Next, again, another standard is our alpha. So this will allow us to make it more transparent if we want. So you can see as I go down, it gets more and more transparent. 1 is the highest, so 1 is fully opaque. In other words, you can't see through it at all. And in our case, we're just going to leave it on alpha 1. Other things I want to talk about is alignment. So again, these are kind of our standard. Horizontal, it's not going to really affect anything right now because it's taking up the entire width of the screen. But if I wanted to, say, position it in the center, well, that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty easy to do. Same with width and height. So right now, width is relative to container. And if I change it, it's not really going to change because it's already taking up the entire width. But I could adjust it as well. So I could come in here and adjust the width if I wanted to. Kind of defeats the purpose of a slider, though, when it's too skinny. You can see it tries its best. So it still has the 3 pips. But you know what? I'm going to reset it back to what it was. Height as well. So it defaults to size to fit content. We can make it relative, in which case it's going to take up basically the entire screen. Not exactly a good use of our screen real estate here. So I'm going to set that back to what it was. So first thing I want to do here really is I just want to open this up in the simulator to just kind of examine it, to see how it works, how it's going to work on such a tiny little watch screen. Okay, so we're just going to see the behavior. And there's not much to it, right? So you can increase it or decrease it, but other than that, not much. So you can see here it starts at value 1. We can increase it up to 4, and we can decrease it. We can actually even get rid of it. But remember that the lowest value that we have associated is 1. So even if it's not displayed here, you know, it's still going to be value 1 assigned to it. But we can also increase it like so. And you can see that it kind of jumps up to 2 because it kind of goes, it still has value 1 associated with it. Now it's value 2. So a little bit strange behavior, but hey, we'll take it. Okay, so let's take our slider and let's actually give it a minimum value of 0. Now we can avoid that wonky behavior that we just saw where it jumps from, say, 0 to 2. And I'm going to load up the simulator there. In the meantime, I'm going to bring in a label here. And the idea is, so when we change a value here on the slider, I want to change the text of the label as well. So you can see I already have labels selected down here in my objects library. So I'm going to grab it, bring it in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just center it. Vertical, actually, horizontal center. And all I want to do really is change the text of the label to the value that we select in our slider. At least initially, that's what I want to do. And by the way, the simulator is loaded. So now if we start from 0, we go up. So now it goes more smoothly. And we're just going to have to make sure we set something to be value 0. And you know what? First of all, let's open up our code. So we can get rid of this side panel. Open up our assistant editor here. And I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to grab the label. I'm going to set it as an outlet. So grab this, grab it over there, outlet my label. Okay, you can see it's a WK interface label, right? And we're just assigning a variable here as we have done many times before. Okay, so that's our variable. Next, let's bring in the function for our slider. So I'm going to control click, bring it over, and make sure that it's an action and not an outlet. And I'll name it to reflect that as well. Action my slider. Okay, and now we can kind of take a look at what it looks like. So we can see that it takes in the value, which is a float. So whatever value it is here, that's going to be what the value is here in our parameters. So initially, if we just want to basically see what the float value is, well, that's pretty easy. So we can actually just say outlet my label, right? So referring to this label up there, dot set text, and we can see that it takes in a string. So if I convert my float to a string, like so, value, so this should show us, and this should update anytime we click the plus or minus, the label should update to display the float value. That's the theory anyway. Now let's load up our simulator and let's make sure that it's working. After that, we can kind of tinker around with it to change what it's showing us. But initially, like I've always been saying, it's good to kind of build it out incrementally like this, so you can catch any errors you have initially. Okay, it should be any second here. Okay, so we can see it just defaults to say label, so we don't have an initial value on it. We can fix that in a bit. But first, let's do this. Okay, so now it's displaying it as the value, right? So it's at position 2.0. Just to zoom in a bit. So it's at position 2.0, now 3.0, and we can see it doesn't allow us to go more than that because we set our max value at 3. And we can go down as well, like so. And again, we can't go below 0. That's the lowest tolerance we have set it at, right? So set 0 is the minimum, 3 is the maximum. And hey, that's pretty cool. We're already controlling something with our slider. Now, it's currently displaying a float. If you would prefer to display it as an integer instead, so you didn't want to see the 0.0, well, that's pretty easy to do. So let's go ahead and do that just because. So let's say let label value equals, and we'll just convert it to an integer here, value. If it was not a round number, it is a rounded because it always ends in 0.0 for our instance. But if you wanted to round it, you could also say round here as well, but we don't need to do that. And then here we will just pass in label value instead of value. Right, so there we go. So now this is going to set it to an integer. And you know what? While we're at it, let's also initialize our label to show whatever the value it's at currently. We can kind of hard code it at first. So we can basically say outlet my label dot set text, and it takes let's see. Actually, you know what? No, let's call a function instead. So we'll say action my slider. We can see that it takes a float. So I'm just going to put float value of 1.0. And basically we're just hard coding it to display what we want it to display. But let's test it out anyway. And then we can kind of make this more complex as we go along. But these are the basics really of the slider. And there's not that much to it. You just have to kind of know how to control whatever you want here. Okay, so now we see that it's showing us the initial value because we hard-coded it. This could have been anything really, but now we can see that it has the behavior we want. And while I'm here, by the way, you might notice that I don't have to click directly on the plus or minus. I can just kind of click on the side of the container that I want to increase or decrease. And that's good to know, right? Because it is going to be on a very small watch face, and it's often hard to be very specific in where you want to touch or tap. So this will allow us to do that. Right, so it's nice to be able to do that. But other than that, that's our basic slider already. Now that we have some behavior down, let's look at changing maybe the appearance of our slider programmatically. And it's going to be very, very similar to other things we've done, for example, labels or timers. So first of all, I'm going to control click this, grab it, bring it over. This one will be an outlet. So yep, we can have actions and outlets associated with the same object. So this one will be outlet my slider. Okay, and everything else looks good. So we'll group these together, put this on a separate line, and we'll mark these as our outlets. Okay, so let's configure our interface objects here in our awake function. So what we can do, we can just grab the variable outlet my slider, and there's a bunch of methods that we can call that are built in. So for example, set color, and we can see that it takes a UI color. So UI color dot, and then we can just select the color. So let's see what cyan looks like. Okay, so this will set the color right away. And while that's loading, we can also check out some other options. So for example, outlet my slider dot. What else can we do? We can set it to be enabled or not. Right? So we can set the number of steps, and we can set these things programmatically. And now you can see that it overrode what we initially set in the attributes builder because we're setting it programmatically here. Right? So now it's going to be cyan. We could say set enabled, true or false. We could set the value as well. And you can see down here it gives a little description. So set value changes the value of this slider. So what if we were to set the value, for example, at 3.0. Let's try that out and see what happens. And again, it's basically like setting any other value programmatically. The only difference is really that it's a slider. And yeah, like I always say, it's a good way to learn. It's just kind of use Swift's autocomplete functionality, and that's really a good way to kind of see what's out there. So for example, we can set the number of steps programmatically, set value, all kinds of things really. But let's take a look. So you can see it defaulted it to 3. Now we can kind of adjust it as well. The label said 1 because we hard coded it to say that, but you know what, we can always just kind of do it this way as well. So I'm going to get rid of the initial value, but I do like that cyan color, so I'm going to leave that as is. But let's set some other values as well. So outlet my slider dot set. Let's set the number of steps, and you can see that it takes an integer, so number of steps. So let's see if I put 10 steps and wait for that to build. Okay. And again, just to remind you the importance of being able to do this programmatically, well, maybe you want to give the user a switch to change the appearance of this, for example. All right, so let's see what happens now. Now we go up. We have a lot of steps, but we don't really have a well-defined behavior for that, right? So we can go up 10 times, but we only really have a max of 3 and a minimum of 0. So, I mean, if you wanted to have kind of incremental building up like this, I don't think it's a good user experience, but you could do it just by having a higher number of steps than you have values, right? And you can even see there's still only 3 segments, so it doesn't really look that good, but it is possible. And at this point, there doesn't appear to be a way to set the minimum or maximum value programmatically. So for that, you would have to use the attribute inspector. But you know, we could definitely do that. So let's give it a maximum of 10 now, and then it's just going to be we'll add that as steps as well. Actually, steps we already did programmatically, so we'll do maximum of 10 here. Right, so let's see what that looks like. Load that up. Okay, any second now. There it goes. Okay, so now we can go 1, 2, 3. It goes all the way up to 10. Right, but it only has the 3 segments, so it still looks kind of weird. So it just kind of shows you're going to have to tinker with this sometimes to get the exact behavior you want. And to do that, I think we're going to need to play again with our attributes inspector here. So we just increment the steps like this. So this is a UI aspect of it, whereas over here we set it programmatically. So a little bit weird, but now we can have the proper feedback as to what's happening. Right, so it just goes to show you can't always do everything programmatically. Usually you can, but not always. Alright, so let's load up our simulator. There it is. Right, so we just, again, we set it to default to 1. That's why it wasn't exactly accurate. But so now we can see a nice little slider. So you can imagine how this could be useful, right? This could be, I don't know, something like a volume slider or brightness or something like that. And I'm sure you've seen this plenty of times in various apps of different kinds. Slider can also be useful if you want to use it in a slightly different way. So right now we're just showing numbers 0 to 10. What if we want to show, say, the year represented as these numbers instead? So let's say you have some kind of registration system and users want to be able to select the year that they registered, for example. So let's figure out how to do that. So first of all, I'm going to go into my main view here and I'm going to bring in another label. Before that, I'm going to bring in a group. And if you've never seen a group before, it's basically a container that you can put other objects into to basically manage the appearance. It's kind of like stacking things in, say, the regular iOS, but you can't really stack in WatchOS, so you put things into a group. So I'm going to be dragging my label in here to my group. In my group, I'm going to make the layout vertical as well. And now I'm going to bring in another label. I'm going to put that into the group on top of this one. And just to make sure that that is the case, I can see over here that my label and group, or my label and outlet, my label, are both inside the group. So that's great. This label, I'm just going to say, let's see, registration year, for example. Right, so it's width, and it's going to fit the content. And then label down here, this is where we'll represent the actual year. So how can we do that? Well, we're going to need to adjust our slider behavior here. So let's say we're going to default to the current year, for example, 2016 as of the time of this recording. Minimum, well, let's say we only want to allow users to go back to, say, I don't know, the year 2000. So if we say launched our app or whatever in the year 2000, we don't want users to be able to go below that. So that's going to be the minimum. Maximum will be 2016, right? Unless you wanted to future date it, in which case you could definitely do that. And steps, well, we can also adjust the steps here. So there's going to be a difference of 16, right, between 2000 and 2016. So steps, we should probably set it at 16 as well. Okay, so this will allow us to kind of display the registration year. Let's try it out. Let's see what this looks like. We'll see if we need to adjust anything as well. Definitely we're going to need to adjust the initialization because it's going to default to 1, but let's see what it does. Okay, wait for that to load up. Yeah, registration year 1. If we try to increase, it doesn't go above 2016, but we can decrease it. And it's acting a little funny because it's taking 16, but it's only giving us 10 steps. And the reason it's doing that is because we set it programmatically over here. So if I just redo this to be 16, this should now work properly. And again, just kind of shows you have to be aware of what your code in the background is doing and what your interface builder is doing as well. So let's see what it looks like now. And from now, there shouldn't be any problems with going up two at a time. That's 2016, 2015. There we go. Exactly. And that's the behavior we wanted. And you know, there's different ways we could implement a way to select the registration year, of course. But if you did want to do it as a slider, this would be the way. So now if we just need to adjust something in our code, we can easily do that. So when we initialize it, well, we want to initialize it to the current year, right? So we can say 216.0. And again, we're just hard coding it in here, and all we're doing is we're setting the label. Right, so we can do that here. We could also kind of cheese it a little bit if we just put it in here in the label. And that's just a different way of doing the same thing. All right, so let's just make sure it is functioning as intended. And other than that, that's basically our label, right? So now we can readjust it as needed. And from here, it's up to you what you really want to do with the slider. Just to show you one other example, we could use, say, a switch statement to change some text maybe down below the slider to maybe give a welcome message or something like that. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to bring in another label, and this one I'm going to put it at the bottom just because. So let's see, vertical bottom, we'll center it, and let's make this, should we make this a different color? Yeah, let's make it, let's make it like red maybe. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so now we have our label. Let's go into our assistant editor. We'll grab this label as well, bring it over. Outlet, my lower label. Okay, there we go, fix our spacing. Okay, so why don't we start out with the label just saying nothing. So we can do that here in our will activate function. So what did we call it again? Outlet, my lower label dot set text. We'll just make it an empty string so that doesn't show anything. And then here in our function, so we can basically set the text here, and we can also kind of set the label. So for example, we'll put in a switch statement. And switch statement, if you've never seen one, looks like this. Switch, and we're going to look out for the label value here where we've already converted it into an integer. So label value. Okay, so label value, and then you just put in a bunch of different cases. So for example, case 2000, right, is an integer, so we can just say 2000. And then down here we can just basically have it do something. So let's have it set the text of the lower label to say .set text, hey old timer, for example. Right, so that's one case. Let's do another case here. Case, oh, I don't know, 2016. Outlet my lower label .set text, hey newcomer. Let's put an exclamation mark as well. And you know what, timer should not be capitalized. There we go. Hey old timer, hey newcomer. And we also want a default just in case none of our cases match, in which case we will just let's see, we will just remove the text. So outlet my lower label .set text just to an empty string. Alright, so let's try it out here. Not getting any errors. Let's launch it in the simulator and see what it does. And really the world's your oyster at this point in terms of sliders. But just to see how this one works, let's check it out. Okay, so it should load up in a second. Alright, so we go down. Let's go back up to 2016. Hey newcomer, that's pretty cool. Otherwise it just sets it to be blank when we go all the way to 2000. Hey old timer. Right, so really simple example of a switch statement, but just kind of shows how you can work in conjunction with labels and really whatever else you need. So any function you need to trigger, you can trigger it here, even with like a switch statement, and this can basically get complex as you need.